David Monroe wasn't supposed to find out like this. One quiet Wednesday morning, the man who had spent 2 decades protecting his family with the unwavering strength of a soldier found himself crumbling in a cold hospital hallway. His youngest daughter, 10-year-old Ella, was barely holding on in the ICU. Her rare blood disorder had escalated without warning, and she needed a transfusion immediately. Doctors rushed to draw blood from David first. After all, he was the father. Right. But when the results came back, the nurse didn't meet his eyes. Instead, she quietly asked him to follow her to the consultation room. The kind of room where news shatters lives. "I'm sorry. You're not a match. In fact, there's no biological compatibility between you and Ella at all." David blinked. Maybe it was a hospital error? A system glitch? But the doctor's face was grim, clinical, certain. David's wife, Julia, had gone home to get fresh clothes. She wasn't there to see his hands tremble. She wasn't there to hear him whisper, "That's not possible. She's my daughter." But in that moment, the ground beneath his world shifted. And it wouldn't stop shaking. For anyone who knew David and Julia Monroe, they seemed like the perfect couple. David was a retired Air Force engineer, the kind of man who fixed leaky faucets at the neighbors for free. Julia, a former teacher turned homemaker, was always seen cheering on their 4 kids at soccer games or school plays. Their home was modest but warm, a quiet life in suburban Ohio. The couple had been married for 22 years and had 4 children: Caleb, 19, Lily, 17, Mason, 14, and Ella, 10. David worked overtime shifts to ensure none of them ever lacked anything. But now, sitting in that white-walled room, David's mind spiraled. What if they were all lies? The doctors advised further testing, purely for medical accuracy. They needed a match fast. That meant checking the siblings, and also confirming biological parentage to identify safe donors. David agreed numbly. "Test me. Test all of us. I want answers." He didn't tell Julia that night. She returned from home looking tired, hugging Ella's pillow, and holding his hand in silence. But David barely slept. Instead, he replayed every moment of his life with the kids, their first steps, birthday cakes, college acceptances. Was it all just borrowed time? The next day, he returned alone to the hospital's diagnostics wing. A second set of tests had come in. He sat down across from a young geneticist with trembling fingers. "Mr. Monroe," the woman began gently, "you are not the biological father of Ella. And you're not a match for any of the children." The words slammed into him like a car crash. Not just Ella. None of the kids. 0 matches. 4 lives. All lies. For 20 years, David had trusted Julia without question. They met in college, got married in their early 20s, and built a life brick by brick. She was the only woman he'd ever loved. He'd never asked questions about her long weekend visits to see her sister. He never doubted when their kids were born without his nose or eye color. Because love blinds you, especially when it feels secure. But now, his entire marriage, his very identity as a father, had been ripped out from under him. Rage and heartbreak warred in his chest. He went home that night and sat in the driveway for 2 hours, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't go inside. Not yet. Not until he knew everything. David turned to the one thing the military taught him best: quiet observation and calculated action. Over the next week, he took time off work. He pretended everything was normal. He kissed Julia on the cheek, helped with homework, and acted like a man trying to hold it together. Meanwhile, he began his own quiet investigation. He obtained their children's birth records. He spoke to an old friend who now worked in forensic analysis. He secretly ran legal-grade DNA tests for all 4 kids. He needed proof, not for the hospital, not for the courts, for himself. The results came in by courier envelope, hand-delivered. Inside was a summary page with 4 devastating truths. Paternity results. Caleb, not the biological child of David Monroe. Lily, not the biological child of David Monroe. Masson, not the biological child of David Monroe. Ella, not the biological child of David Monroe. Julia had never told him. Not once. Not even when their marriage was at its strongest. David had raised someone else's children for 20 years. But that wasn't even the worst part. He noticed something strange in the report metadata, a common genetic pattern running across all 4 kids. A suspicious detail flagged by the lab technician that required further confirmation. And just as David picked up the phone to ask for clarification, his eldest son Caleb walked into the room, holding a brown envelope of his own. "Dad, we need to talk." "About Mom." Caleb placed the envelope on the table. "I did a test too. And I think I know who our real father is, but you're not going to like it." David Monroe stared at the envelope on the table like it was ticking. The same kind of envelope that had just dismantled everything he thought he knew about his family. Now Caleb, his oldest son, no, someone else's son, was standing in front of him, hands trembling, eyes dark with something David couldn't quite name. "Where did you get that?" David asked, his voice barely holding steady. Caleb hesitated. "Mom's closet. It was taped behind an old box of photo albums." The room felt like it had no oxygen. David slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a faded photograph of Julia in her early 20s, laughing, her arm around a man David didn't recognize. Below it was a crumpled letter in Julia's handwriting, addressed to someone named Marcus. "You promised you'd stay away. We had an agreement. The kids can't ever know the truth." David's heart stuttered. He flipped the photo over. Marcus Weller, 2005, Columbus. And below that, in Caleb's handwriting. "This man shows up in every background check. He's been around, all our lives." The next 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and obsession. David knew Marcus Weller's name now, and with that, a trail of breadcrumbs began to emerge. He ran Marcus through old contact logs. He pulled his Air Force security clearance to look into federal databases. What he found turned his stomach. Marcus Weller had a record sealed from public view, but there were whispers of him being involved in financial fraud, identity theft, and coercion. Nothing stuck. But he'd been investigated. Multiple times. And he lived in every city Julia had ever claimed to visit her sister in. David's hands shook as he pieced it all together. Was Julia not only unfaithful, but entangled in something much darker? He needed confirmation. So he reached out to an old friend, Lena Torres, now a federal marshal. Lena met David at a diner just off the highway. She knew his reputation, solid, rational, never the paranoid type. "David," she said after scanning the documents. "This guy, Marcus Weller. You need to be careful. He was part of a major investigation that got buried. Multiple women, multiple identities. He's been using fake names, changing addresses, and one of his aliases matched a property deed Julia co-signed in 2010. David blinked. "Julia bought a house with him. Or used his identity," Lena replied. "Either way, it's a tangle. And you've got 4 kids possibly connected to this guy. If this gets out in court, things could get ugly, fast." David clenched his jaw. "I don't care about the court. I want the truth. I want to protect my kids, even if they're not mine by blood." That night, David returned home with a plan. He waited until the kids were asleep. Julia was in the kitchen, washing dishes like it was any other Thursday. He placed the envelope on the table. Her eyes flicked to it, then to his face, then away. "I found him," David said, voice low. "Marcus Weller. Or should I say, the man who fathered our kids." Julia froze. Her back was to him. Her shoulders began to tremble. "I didn't know how to tell you," she whispered. David's voice cracked. "You had 20 years. Julia collapsed into a chair. "He was dangerous, David. I was scared. I left him before I met you, but he always found a way back. I tried to move on. You were safe. You were good. I didn't think the truth would ever matter. David felt his knees give way. But you let me raise his children. Every holiday. Every hospital bill. Every bedtime story. Julia looked up, eyes red. I thought I was protecting them. But before David could respond, Caleb stepped out of the hallway. He had heard everything. I think I met him, Caleb said softly. Once. At a gas station a few years ago. He said he was a friend of Mom's. Gave me $20. I thought nothing of it, until I saw that photo. David turned to him. You okay? Caleb nodded slowly. Yeah. But I want to know who I am. Who we are. So I took it further. He pulled out his phone and opened a background check app. Marcus Weller is using a new name now, Dr. Daniel Reese. He's living under the radar in Pittsburgh. Works at a private genetics lab. David's jaw clenched. You're telling me the man who fathered my kids is hiding in plain sight as a scientist? Caleb nodded. And he's running DNA sequencing programs. Quiet ones. Black budget style. Mom might have been protecting us from more than just lies. David stood slowly. The military part of him clicking into focus. If he's still out there, this isn't over. David stood in the doorway, watching Julia sob quietly into her hands. Then he turned to Caleb. Get in the car. We're going to Pittsburgh. I want to meet Dr. Daniel Reese, face to face. Caleb hesitated. What if he doesn't want to be found? David stared out into the night. Then we'll make him wish he stayed hidden. David Monroe's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he turned onto the quiet suburban street outside Pittsburgh. Next to him sat Caleb, stiff and silent, clutching a printout of the address for Dr. Daniel Reese, aka Marcus Weller, the man who had upended their lives without ever being part of them. The house wasn't much. Modern, gray brick, quiet neighborhood. No signs of the chaos he'd left in his wake. A forgotten ghost hiding behind credentials and lab coats. David pulled up to the curb and looked at Caleb. You don't have to come in, he said. Caleb stared at the house. I want to see the man who created me and left. David nodded. Then he got out, walked up the path, and rang the doorbell. The man who opened the door looked ordinary. Late 40s, graying temples, dressed in khakis and a polo. But David recognized him immediately from the photo, Marcus Weller. He blinked. Can I help you? David's voice was a scalpel. Yeah. I think you know exactly who I am. And who this is. Caleb stepped into view. For the first time, Marcus faltered. His eyes flicked between them, calculating. I think you should come inside, he muttered. Inside, David scanned the pristine living room. No photos. No trace of family. Cold, clinical, like the man himself. I know what you did, David said. To Julia. To me. To my family. Marcus leaned back in his chair, sighing. She told me to stay away. David's eyes narrowed. And yet you didn't. Marcus smirked. I didn't need to. I was always there. You just never noticed. Caleb clenched his fists. Why didn't you ever reach out to us? Marcus shrugged. Because I didn't want a family. I wanted control. David stood. So you let another man raise your children just so you could manipulate her? Keep her scared? Marcus's face hardened. She made her choices. And you were too blind to see it. David's voice dropped. I'm not blind anymore. Back in Ohio, Julia was falling apart. After David left, she tried to cover her tracks, deleting emails, shredding letters, making calls. But one thing slipped, a hidden email from Marcus stored on a USB drive in her closet. Lily found it. It wasn't just betrayal. It was blackmail. You'll keep the truth buried or I tell your husband everything. You owe me, 4 times over. Julia had been paying Marcus in secret for years. Using David's retirement fund. Selling family heirlooms. All to keep the lie from surfacing. And when she finally confessed to Lily and Mason, Her house of cards collapsed. The kids left the house that night, too angry to speak. And Julia? She was left in the silence of her own ruin. Meanwhile, David wasn't just here for answers, he was here for justice. What Marcus didn't know was that Lena Torres, David's federal marshal friend, had been listening in from a surveillance van outside. The moment Marcus admitted to financial coercion and knowingly faking identities under multiple names, the signal was sent. Within minutes, agents swarmed the house. Marcus stood frozen, a cold sneer on his lips. "You think this will change anything?" David walked right up to him, looked him in the eye. "No," he said. "But it ends the way it should, with you being held accountable." As Marcus was led away in cuffs, Caleb whispered, "Good." Back in Ohio, the Monroe house felt like a crime scene of the emotional kind. Julia tried to apologize to her children, but they wouldn't hear it. Each of them had a different reaction. Caleb wanted distance. He moved in with a friend, trying to rebuild trust with David. Lily spiraled, confused about her identity, refusing to speak to either parent. Mason buried himself in video games and silence. Ella, too young to grasp the full truth, simply clung to David and asked why Mom was crying all the time. Julia eventually left. Quietly. No fights. No goodbyes. David let her go. The next few months were slow. Painful. But healing began, quietly. David sat down with each child individually. Not to explain Julia's actions, but to affirm his own. "I chose to love you," he told Mason. "I raised you," he whispered to Lily. "I will always be your father," he said to Caleb. "You are mine," he told Ella as she slept. Marcus Weller, or Dr. Daniel Reese, was formally charged with identity fraud, financial coercion, and intent to deceive under multiple identities, thanks to the paper trail Julia's payments had left. He pled guilty. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. Julia, though not charged criminally, was ordered to reimburse the drained retirement fund and relinquish custody rights. She moved to another state. Alone. One night, David sat at the dinner table with his children. There were gaps where photos once hung, and laughter was still hard to come by. But slowly, stories returned. Games resumed. And love, the real kind, rerouted itself in truth. Caleb lifted his glass of water. "To Dad," he said. "The only one who ever showed up." The others raised their glasses. David smiled quietly. But deep down, he knew this truth. DNA makes a man a father, for a moment. But love makes him a dad, for a lifetime. Even in long marriages, secrecy around financial accounts, disappearing funds, or evasiveness about your children's medical history should never be ignored. Always maintain medical compatibility documentation in your family records. And remember, love can be blind, but data doesn't lie. When in doubt, verify with legal and medical professionals discreetly.